Howdy.
How's it going?
Going well. We had a cool guest on today.
Yeah, this is a subject that we've often thought we must do and we've finally done, which is sports and gender. And we've got a brilliant person to speak to. Coach Blade, she's going to be speaking in Denver, and you can still get your streaming tickets, I think, maybe, but you'll certainly be able to see it in the future if you can't. And, you know, she's doing a presentation in Denver, like when sports meets trans ideology or gender ideology. And it's well named because she has been there for decades. Mm-hmm. She's a real expert in elite sports, and it just shines from her that she's into the kind of concept of sporting chance, you know, fairness in sport. And that's why she's such a brilliant representative to speak about fairness in sport in this context.
Yeah, she herself was an athlete, a very elite level athlete, and then she's been coaching for decades. And what's interesting is Dr. Blade also lived all around the world. She lived in Nigeria. Yeah. She lived in Iran. She's lived in all these different cultures and
grew up down by the Amazon. Like she had this extraordinary childhood.
She grew up in Bolivia. I mean, she tells us this. I mean, you'll see our faces. The story that we launched with about her childhood was like absolutely remarkable. So she really surprised me because I've been following her work for a while, but there's so many interesting aspects of her story. And we got to ask Coach Blade, like all of our burning questions about trans and sports. And if you stick around for our listener community section, we also asked her about this new trend of non-binary athletes and making like third sports categories. Because this is often argued as like, this is the great solution, just make a third category. Mm-hmm. But as Coach Blade explains, like there are a lot of problems with that too. And we just talked about the kind of fairness in sports and what happens when you introduce, gender hormones, and does that force other athletes to start doping even if they're not trans? Like it was a super interesting conversation. Yeah, so before we get into it, we just want to ask if you're on YouTube, and you like watching us here, please like and subscribe to our channel. We have awesome comments.
I have to say, smash that subscribe button. Because I've been laughed at.
Stella kind of had a little bit of fun poked at her in the comments on Twitter by our friend Laura Becker. But now you just have to say it every time. So say it again.
Smash that subscribe button. I am down with it.
Stella got like her 15 minutes of fame on TikTok, and now she's like a big time YouTuber. Okay, here, I'm going to read about Coach Blade. Dr. Linda Blade is a former Canadian champion from 1986 and a full scholarship NCAA All-American in track and field. As a chartered professional coach, Linda has worked internationally for over 30 years with hundreds of athletes. Her expertise is extended to leadership roles, provincial president of Athletics Alberta, where she developed sex-based eligibility guidelines, which actually we talk about today. It was really interesting. She's the co-author of a book called Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. She's a collaborator in the establishment of the International Consortium on Female Sports, and Linda has been publicly advocating for fairness and safety for female athletes since 2018. So she was a phenomenal guest. Yeah. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Coach Linda Blade.
Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we probe the gender landscape within contemporary culture.
And we consider the implications of prioritizing personal identity over other aspects of the self.
This is the thinking person's take on gender.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. Hi, Coach Blade and Stella. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hey, Linda.
It's really nice to meet you. Stella knows you because you're going to be speaking at the Gen Spect conference. So you guys have been in touch. This is my first time meeting with you. I'm really excited to talk with you today. Yeah. Stella, what do you think? Should we ask Linda to just take us back in time to the beginning, to the childhood years, which is where we tend to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that we haven't really gone there with sports and gender. And I think it has become bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm so pleased to have you on so that you can kind of, you've got the long perspective because you can tell us the whole thing. So I think we've got the right woman to present. So you lead us, Linda.
Yes, it's a big part of my life. Sport itself has been a big part of my life right from the beginning. And I have to say, even though I live in Canada, I'm Canadian, I started out in South America, and I was a daughter of missionary religious Bible translators who were learning the language of the Inca Empire, you know, Machu Picchu and all that. They have 3 dialects of that language, and they were helping, like, having a bunch of people from different religions and denominations together as a team, translating the Bible from Spanish into Quechua. And I was just one of these little kids who was born up in the Andean highlands in the adobe hut. And I was running around the streets playing football with the boys. And the other missionaries didn't really like it too much, but my parents were quite supportive. Some of the years I was in the Amazon rainforest because there were other projects going on down in the Amazon. So I'm truly an Amazon woman.
Wow.
And so between being barefoot in the Amazon paths and trails and swimming in oxbow lakes that had piranhas on the other side, to going into the highlands and playing football in the streets with the boys. I mean, I was just this ragamuffin girl. Like I just loved sports. I loved playing outside. And I had a brother who was close to me. So we were always partners in crime, always like getting into fights. Like I was just this terrible little girl who was not gender conforming at all. And even if the odd times I would show up to church, like if I was training later when I was starting to train for Bolivian sports clubs and track teams, you know, I'd go for a run in the morning. I'd be all dusty and I'd throw a skirt over my shorts and sit in the back pew of the church. And it was all like dirty and dusty. And people, I don't know. It wasn't even being a rebel. It was just being me. I just loved being outside and playing. And I was so grateful. Really, honestly, my parents put up with a lot of criticisms, I think, of me. And they never let it sort of stick to me. They just said, well, that's her life. It's not her fault. We're down here in South America doing this stuff. And they let me do it. And I became champion of Bolivia by 15 before we came to Canada. Like I was actually national champion, and I did the South American circuit with the ladies. And I mean, the very first time, my first trip away from home was with the Bolivian team. And it was so bad because like the men got to sleep in the bunk beds and we had to put our sleeping bags on the floor of a classroom. And then we had to get up that morning and make tea and breakfast for the men. Like it was just ridiculous.
God.
I mean, right away, like I understood, even though my parents didn't really treat me that way, I kind of right away got the message that in most places, even if you're going to be in sports, you're going to kind of be a second-class citizen if you're a woman. Yeah. And it just started from there. And I was lucky then to come back to Canada for high school. And then right away I was good enough, but right away I got recruited into the NCAA and got a chance to have, you know, I was poor as dirt. I mean, I'm glad I got that scholarship so I could get my education. I'm really, really grateful to the Title IX legislation. I came in about 10 years after that legislation in the 80s. And then, you know, just so many different experiences. And then during the 80s, of course, that was when the doping was happening with the East Germans. And then I was on the Canadian team. I was Canadian champion. And then I would be going over to Europe. And, you know, 1 year I'd be beating some girl. And then a year later, her voice had dropped like an octave. And now she is beating me by 1,000 points. Like it just was so frustrating.
And you're talking about like track and field events, right? Like, can you explain like what were you competing in?
Okay, so you know Bruce Jenner did the decathlon, which is 10 events, and so it's like best overall athlete all around. Okay. And women do the heptathlon, which is 7 events, and so you're the best sort of all around, you know, performer. And I was doing the heptathlon, so I did all the different events.
Which are, can you just tell
Okay,
tell us what
you start, day 1 is 100 meter hurdles, shot put, high jump, 200 meter race.
Okay.
And then the second day, it's long jump, javelin, spear throwing, and then the half mile race. So it's speed, endurance, throwing, jumping, all the different things. So just to test different aspects of your, what I call now as a sports scientist, biomotor abilities. And I did end up becoming a PhD in kinesiology and sports science. But that was, of course, in the 90s. That was after all of my career and in terms of it being an athlete. And then later became a coach. And then even later than that, in 2014, became president of track and field, president of the board of the Track and Field Association here where I live in the province of Alberta. And that's where I hit the wall on this gender stuff because I had to be on committees where they were pushing a new policy. And so that's kind of my long sort of journey into this whole gender, struggle.
Could I come in there? It would be great if you could outline, because I remember the 80s and the East Germans, and it would be great if you could tell me your first experiences and your kind of how you noticed that arc of, if for people who don't know, there was a doping scandal of testosterone for East German athletes that everybody was aware of. It wasn't even hiding in plain sight. It was in plain sight as far as I could see. Even for a young kid that I was watching. You were there, you were competing. So do you remember when you first, and what was the talk in the locker rooms, and what was it like back then?
Well, even when I was still sort of in the late 70s, I was just coming back home. I was Bolivian champion South America. Even then we'd start hearing about these things. And I actually had a German coach who had been brought to Bolivia as like a foreign aid from Germany to this poor country of Bolivia. And suddenly I had one of the best coaches in the world. So he was a German coach, and, we kind of talked a little bit about stuff. He wouldn't talk too much about it. But I mean, already I had become aware of why are the Germans so good and everybody else not so good, especially East Germans. And I knew the difference between East Germany and West Germany. But anyway, when I got back to Canada, and then I was on the national team in the 80s. That was just around the time when the testing had started to happen for those drugs. But we also knew that the people who were good at it, who are good at cheating, knew how to beat the tests. And that was the frustrating thing. And for me personally, obviously, like every track and field athlete, my goal was to make the Olympic team. And I was the best in the country, on and off with this other girl, but we were the best. And I was definitely aiming for the 1988 Olympic Games, which was the doping actually caused me to miss the Olympics because... because what happened was in Canada, we had like the World Track and Field they have a list, like in the heptathlon, in my event, you were listed because you have performances. It's the beauty of track and field is it's just measurements of distance and time and speed. Like you have the people's performances and they put them on a list, right? And so if Canada just decided they'd make it easy on themselves and just say, we won't really have an Olympic trials per se. Like if you have to be within the top 15 of that list to make the team. But the problem is, if there's 25 people from East Germany and Russia, Soviet Union cheating, and they're listed on that list, you don't have a chance because you're actually down below that. You're not ranked as high as them because they. And a lot of those performances were actually done in countries where in moments where we knew there was no test at that competition. And yet the international governing body kept putting them on this list because they'd find the result and put them on this list. And so I trained super, super hard that year trying to improve without doping, and I ended up hurting myself because, you push it too hard. Sport is always about pushing that limit.
Balancing.
And and actually even now in my whole career, the kind of fitness I do is sport performance fitness. Well, people say, what's the difference between sport performance fitness and regular health related fitness? And the point is you're pushing people to the edge. So basically if we would say that falling off a cliff is getting injured, my job even today is to push somebody as close to that edge without letting them fall off, right? And I fell off the cliff and got hurt. And the reason I did was because I was trying really so hard. I was training 5 and 6 hours a day, trying to get up on that list. And it just didn't work because they were all cheating. And then when my compatriot, Ben Johnson, then he got caught doping. He was on that team and he got caught doping. And then that was like the big scandal.
Huge.
Which is, I'll explain as we go along, but there was a direct link from him getting caught doping to what happened all these years later in terms of the gender thing.
How?
And so there is a link there. Like I explained it. So I explained it in my book on sporting. So I'll just show it now. I'll plug it.
Yeah.
I wrote the book with Barbara Kay, journalist Barbara Kay, and we wrote that in 2021, and it's called Unsporting. So basically what happened was after Ben Johnson got caught, and it was like this massive global scandal, Canadian guy in the 100 meters, he won the 100, and the 100 meters was like, obviously the big event, and he beat Carl Lewis, and then he got caught. Massive. And basically, so the Canadians were so, obviously feeling like embarrassed and astonished that we got caught, us nice Canadians. Yeah. Like, meanwhile, the East Germans had been cheating all this time, and so they never get caught, but we got caught, and like, we're the bad guys. And so, and around 2003, like, things went until like various committees and investigations, and finally they set up this thing called this non-government agency, basically not-for-profit, called the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. So basically the CCES, their job was to ensure, their only mandate was to ensure that Canadians would not cheat. And so their whole message was they would do the doping control even on national team members. They would go around the country, giving lectures about how you shouldn't cheat. And when I was president of track and field in Alberta, and I went to my national meeting in 2018, and I found out that we were now supposed to consider a policy that were men, it was the most extreme policy, honestly. No surgery, no hormonal mitigation. A man could come one day and say he's a woman and compete, and then he could compete as a man the next day. It was complete self-ID they were pushing. And of course, knowing the difference between men and women on our national records, I was looking at around my colleagues at the table, and I found out that CCES, that entity that was supposed to be telling Canadians not to cheat, that was the entity pushing this policy and telling everybody that you were bigots if you didn't let males to self-identify in women's sports, which is cheating. I mean, it's like the one entity that was supposed to be non-cheating and fair sport was the one telling all the sports that if you don't do this, then you're hateful and bigoted. And like, somebody captured that organization, and just the very one that was supposed to not. Yeah, I mean, it was like bizarre, because knowing that went from our worst scandal to now them pushing a self-ID. I couldn't even believe it.
Wow.
We'd like to jump in here really quick and offer up a thank you to GenSpect, one of our sponsors. GenSpect is an international organization that offers a healthy approach to sex and gender, and they're hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Denver, Colorado this November. Be sure to listen to our episode number 134 to hear about all the amazing speakers lined up, and visit genspect.org to order tickets. And if you can't make it in person, online tickets are available.
We'd also like to give a shout out to GETA, Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. If you're looking for a therapist for yourself or your child, check out the GETA directory. And if you're a clinician who is questioning the affirmation model and you're looking for resources and community, please consider joining GETA today. Visit genderexploratory.com to learn more.
Well, something you've talked about before is that actually ever since the Olympics had women's divisions, there were males trying to get in. This is in the early 1900s.
Right.
So, yeah. I mean, that seems to be related to what you're describing here.
Yeah.
Like, there are always these loopholes people are trying to create, even ethics committees, unfortunately. But can you talk to us about that context? Because I feel like for a lot of people, myself included, I had no idea that was ever an issue. And I thought that this was a really contemporary thing around the trans debate, but actually you've said it's not. So can you tell us about that?
So right away, like at least track and field, the first Olympics we were in was in Amsterdam in 1928. So even though the Olympics started in 1900, track and field for women wasn't in there until 28. But as soon as that happened, like even in the early 1930s, before we had to all stop competing because of World War II and Nazis and all that, already there were males who were coming in, and it was obvious that they were men competing in the women's event. So right away, the International Olympic Committee had to deal with the fact that there would be certain men trying to get into women's events just because they wanted the notoriety or getting a medal or maybe getting a prize. And so there were a number of ways that, first of all, it was just like you had to go get a doctor's clearance to attend the Olympic Games. But then eventually, and there was only one time in the 1960s that they did the old nude parade where all the female athletes had to walk in front of a panel of judges naked. But that was just one time. And that time is used all the time to say we should never test for sex verification. No, after that time, they did what like the old cheek swab, like that, where you get like you get a Q-tip and you get a piece of buccal cells, and they're looking for the bar bodies, which is going to have one black dot of the two X chromosomes, and that was used even during my time. I did a sex verification test for certain competitions. Was nothing compared to the doping control where you have to pee like 100 cc's into a cup, and that takes a long time when you're dehydrated. And like the doping control is more invasive than doing the sex verification. But somehow by the 90s, they did one more try to upgrade from the bar body test to like cheek swab, from the cheek swab to blood testing at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. And so the blood testing involved, looking for the SRY gene, like the genetics. So that was the time when they went into trying to do that. And it was, a huge number of samples had to be taken, and lots of athletes tested, and they did find 7 or 8 males in that group, but they let them compete anyway for some reason. And the Olympic officials by 1999 published an article in a journal, a science journal, saying that it was too expensive, too inconvenient, and it made the female athletes feel too uncomfortable. So they're going to stop doing that to test. They're going to stop verification altogether. Sorry.
Could I point out something? I remember reading in the Helen Joyce book, Trans, that, women with intersex conditions, often known as DSDs, are overrepresented in elite women's sports by a factor of 140. And it was an astonishing statistic that made me review the entire sports scenario, because then I suddenly realized all of those, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, like I was really into sports, all those talk of, she's a man. There was so many of certain sports athletes. Yeah. And then when I looked at what the Olympics did to figure out whether somebody was a woman or not, you know what I mean? They tried to do it by the like you said, the parade the body. They've tried to do it by testosterone levels. They've tried to do it by chromosome levels. They've never found a way, because of the fact that elite sports is very, very overrepresented by women with elevated testosterone because of their intersex condition. It seems to me, and I put it to you, that it's almost an impossible job to figure out how are we going to differentiate between who can compete and who cannot, because some people with intersex conditions have really high testosterone. They do have a natural,
Well, if you're XX with a DSD, I think that's just bad luck for the rest of us. If you're a woman and you have naturally high levels of like endogenous testosterone, I mean, tough luck for us, because you're a woman and you're intersex, but you're seen as somehow intersex, but you're 2 X chromosomes, female, no XY, no SRY gene. I think at the end of the day, we're just going to have to be put up with that, because that's a kind of unfairness, but it's a natural unfairness because they're female. And I just
it's a natural variation that exists.
It is a natural variation within the female population. And so lucky you got, you have, I don't know, hyperandrogynous, whatever. And basically, I just don't believe that you should be taking drugs to suppress something.
Mm-hmm.
You're either in that you're either in that category or you're not in that category. And if it's endogenously produced, then the problem we're having is the DSD males who do have an SRY gene. Exactly. They are in there, and those are the ones that we need the screening for, because it's not fair if they have an unfair advantage, because it's like genetic cheating. Like you've got an extra thing there.
Well, they're male and they have an unfair advantage, while the others are female and have arguably a natural advantage. Yeah,
a natural advantage. But I would say the female DSD, I would be, I've changed my position. I thought in the past you should mitigate their testosterone, but truthfully, now that I've seen it and I thought it through, if we're going to say like that's the dividing line is the chromosome and the SRY gene, presence of the gene that's active, it has to be active, then that has to be our dividing line. And within that, if it's endogenous, away you go, right? But we should not be allowing people who have the male gene in the female competition. That's where you draw the line, and as far as I'm concerned. But the thing is, the IOC just, basically chickened out, and they didn't want to have to police it. So by 2000, they had thrown out the screening entirely. And then by 2003, in the Stockholm Consensus, the group of men just decided, based on one doctor's research, where he measured, Dr. Louis Guron measured a bunch of transsexuals before surgery and then after, as far as some of their strength and stuff. And then Dr. Emma Hilton talked about it in one of her presentations, but by 2003, they figured that, there wouldn't be that many. It's okay. We could let them compete with women if they haven't had the surgery. And I have the quote here somewhere. He said, so the conclusion was, okay, they did know that the transsexuals would still be having a competitive advantage, having more strength and all of the male advantages, like larger bodies. Nothing changes in terms of your lung size and all that, heart size. Clearly, you're not going to shrink your heart just because you had a part of your anatomy removed, right? So you're still going to have advantages. But he said this, when they decided to allow transsexuals in 2003, they said, depending on the levels of arbitrariness one wants to accept, it is justifiable that reassigned males can compete with other women. So it really wasn't based on science. It was just arbitrary. Wow. And it was based on a social imperative. Like that was there. And then the interesting thing is, then in 2015, suddenly even the requirement for surgery was lifted by the IOC. And the question is kind of why. That was like a mystery, because the gatekeeping, at least surgical requirement, was pretty restrictive. But then all of a sudden you wouldn't require surgery anymore. Now anybody can self-identify. And at that time, at 2015, you just had to lower your testosterone to a certain level, which 10 nanomoles per liter down, like from 30 to 10. But 10 is still way higher than any woman. Like most women, the top range is 2.5 or something like that. So it's still going to be unfair to women. But I know that there was a male transsexual who was trying to sue. He was a cyclist. And because he had been, he had a gonadectomy, he didn't have circulating testosterone. So when he tried to train in cycling for the women's races, he didn't have enough testosterone to recover from his workout. So he said it was a medical necessity that he should be allowed to have, like, therapeutic use exemption, TUE, Jesus, to take some testosterone so he could still compete as a woman. Like, it's just unbelievable. Like, he really, why didn't they just say, look, you've had a gonadectomy, you don't have circulating testosterone, clearly a male body needs testosterone, so just take testosterone, go back in the men's division. That's would have been the answer.
Yeah.
But he wanted to keep competing as a female. So that's where it led to, that whole case led to the 2015 lifting of the surgical requirement.
I wanted to touch on something. But before we started, I was having a conversation with one of our producers who was saying something like, athletes always make decisions about various things, whether it's in their kind of professional life or their personal life. Like a woman decides to, like a female athlete, let's say she decides to have a baby. That's going to necessitate that she take a season off or something. And, we were talking earlier about, powerlifting and bodybuilding sports. There's a tested and untested division. If you decide that you want to use performance enhancing drugs, you cannot compete against the tested athletes because they're naturals. And so it's like so interesting how these trans athletes who also seem to be activists, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to make these decisions about medical interventions with their bodies, despite the fact that they're athletes. And then they also expect for everyone to bend the rules around them because of those individual decisions they made. And like, can you just talk a little bit about that, especially as a coach? Like, you have athletes under your care who you have to advise about like different decisions they make and what will the trade-offs be and what is this going to mean for your next season? Like, talk a little bit about that from the coach's perspective or from a, athlete's perspective.
Yeah, well, it didn't make sense to me from the very first time I saw the policy that was on the table. And I called the CEO of this Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport, and I asked him, like, Paul, what is going on? Like, I'm looking at this document. None of the other men from the other presidents are telling me anything. Like, why are we trying to do this? Why is your organization, who's supposed to be your only, Paul, that testosterone, it gives people an advantage, which is why you do your doping control. And then why are you allowing male bodies? Are you saying that male bodies can compete against female? And all he would do is clearly ideological, because throughout that entire phone conversation, he kept saying, well, we have to be, profile safety and inclusion and equity. And I said, it's not safe, because if there's a man, in a contact sport, it's not, it's not inclusive, because if there's men and women's finals, they're going to exclude the women from the medal. So it's opposite of that. And it's obviously not equitable, because it's not fair. And it's not fair. And he just kept saying, no, we have to be safe, inclusive. Like he would not talk to me like a normal human being. So I knew that right away. So anyway, as a coach, it blew my mind, because everything we tried to teach athletes, this was against those principles. The whole point of being an athlete or one of the values and advantages of being an athlete is clearly that you learn how to have discipline, and you learn how to have foresight, and you have to plan, and you do have to have your, all of the sequence and strategies, how you're going to win and do it fairly, and how, and even like, that's why I would say Title IX in the States has helped in the American society, like all those soccer moms, and it's helped this American culture so much in the sense of women now, a huge amount of, like, it's something like 95% of women who are executives in these big companies have all had sports in their background. Why? Because it gives you confidence. It gives you, all of those things. So all of the learning how to even lose properly, having the confidence to lose, and then say, well, I'll try harder next time, or y'all find out. So when you have a paradigm where, and this is my concern as a coach, if you have a paradigm where you're trying to teach your athletes all these different skill sets, emotionally, ethically, physically, and none of those rules apply to the other person. Yeah. What you're doing to the female cohort is you're actually doing the opposite of what sport is normally empowering to women and girls. What you're really doing is the opposite. You're teaching them learned helplessness. Yeah. Because they know they don't have a chance. Yeah. And that is going to be utterly destructive in their entire lives. Like, whether they'll have no confidence in knowing that the system is going to treat them fairly, or they won't have the confidence if they all try something. But there's even no way to know, like, let's say you lose to a male. How do you self-assess? I know. Like, how do you even say, like, okay, because an advantage of being an athlete is to say, well, okay, So that person beat me when I was running the corner. They passed me. So obviously I got to improve my curve running. I need to improve.
Yeah.
Or like if I was a high jumper, I need to hold my hip a little longer over the bar. I have to. Yeah. But if somebody comes along and just has the worst technique, and this is what we're seeing a lot of these men who are coming into women's sports, like even the cyclists, they're telling me they have the worst form. They're not even technically great. They're just winning because they have better bodies. And so as a female, you have no ability to self-assess and have a strategy to improve yourself.
And could I ask, what is the kind of morale among the girls, like, who are actually on the field? Are they generally just nodding along? Are they responding like you did in the 80s, which is effectively overtraining? I just need to work harder.
Trying to overcompensate.
Or are they quite privately furious about what's going on? Because this is a form
privately
of cheating.
Furious.
Are they?
Privately furious, yes. And some of them self-excluding, like they don't want to deal with it anymore. We have one athlete in Canada who's on the Team Canada and choosing to speak out. And it was only from this past year, April Hutchinson, who's the powerlifter. And her association's first response was to try to discipline her, like subject her to disciplinary action because she's speaking out and violating the code of conduct. You're supposed to put the sport in a good light, you know. But the male who's in her competition, he goes on Instagram and starts bragging about why are women so bad at this, like why am I winning, and like he's constantly trying to gaslight the women. And not just, if you just shut up and compete, that'd be one thing, that'd even be bad, but he goes on there and tries to demean women that he's competing with, saying they have little T-Rex arms. It's unbelievable. And she's been trying. So our International Consortium on Female Sport, which is an umbrella group of all the different sports, women's sports advocacy groups like Fair Play for Women, you know, Icons Women in the States, we're all trying to get together now and collaborate to advocate for things. And we wrote letters as the organization to Canadian Powerlifting Union about April, saying, like, you got to be fair to her, and you got to change your policy and align even with the international powerlifting, which they're not doing. And so, you know, this whole process has been so hard. I've been watching April go through this. Like, this is one of the first athletes I've been able to witness who's literally trying to stand up to a system that's stacked against her. And the amount of emotional trauma that she's been going through, and she just keeps speaking out. She was on Tucker Carlson. Like, she just keeps speaking out, like, 'cause she's such a strong woman. But I mean, but she entered powerlifting because she had alcoholism and other things in her life. It helped her with her therapy. And the message that the CPU has been sending is, well, we'll let a man use sport for his therapy, social acceptance and whatever, but we don't care if we're fair to April or any of the women who are maybe also doing sports for their therapy. Like, it's definitely a bias, and she's been called every name in the book, and it's been terrible. But I mean, we have Icons Women in the States has been behind April, and there's a number of women that have helped, you know, pay for the legal help that she's getting. So it's slowly starting, but the amount of effort that it has taken this year to move that boulder like 1 inch is incredible. And it's really been insightful for me to see how much work it's going to take to push this back. Once you open the gate, how do you close it and get them all out again? It's going to be super hard.
Yeah. You know, I'm thinking too about just like to kind of continue with Stella's question about the psychological impact. It feels like an abusive relationship where
it is,
like, especially when I was following the UPenn swimming story, the kinds of reports coming out of that women's locker room and what the young women were told, what the athletes were told, was so shocking, because it's like they see that this person is abusing the rules and they're uncomfortable and they know something wrong is happening to them. And they're basically told, this is your emotional problem because you're not being accommodating enough and you have your own biases. And that's exactly what happens to somebody in an abusive relationship. It's like, I mean, gaslighting is a term used way too much in our society, but that's exactly what it is. And it's so crazy how quickly this has come in. And how few people have the ability to speak up about it. Like, it's
Right.
so unfair that it's put on the shoulders of the athletes themselves to like make a campaign about this when they are supposed to be focused on their sport. Like, there's so much about it. It's so frustrating.
I know. And basically, so you reminded me of a moment right after, like, when I first became aware of all this around 2018, I actually took the president of Athletics Canada to dinner, and I basically said, like, Bill, please tell me, like, why is this happening? Like, men have an advantage, and kind of hummed and hawed and kind of gave me a smirk. And I said, oh, I see. Okay, so I get what's happening here. You're afraid, our whole association's afraid that these few men, male self-appointed, females or whatever, are going to sue you. They're going to sue. You're worried about them, about another male suing the association. I said, but don't you understand that there are way more girls and women who are going to be disaffected that might also be suing you? So, like, the chances of a lawsuit are much higher by allowing this inclusion than the other way around. And he looked straight at me and said, girls wouldn't do that.
Did he?
Are you joking?
I'm not joking. That's exactly what he said. I'm quoting exactly. He said, girls wouldn't do that.
And arguably...
So the assumption is that we would just we're supposed to sit and take it. We won't ever...
Girls are nice. They don't sue. What?
That's right.
How many girls are suing?
Let me put it this way. There are probably about 4 or 5 cases that are pending because we're just raising money for them right now. But it will happen. And I think Riley Gaines has, she's going to be suing. And I think April Hutchinson, this Canadian girl, if things don't turn around pretty quickly, she's going to sue. So we actually have, I think we're going to be able to start doing it, but it does, again, force us to raise the money and, puts another burden on us to try to do this.
If our listeners want to contribute to these legal funds, can you give us like a link? We'll be sure to put it in the notes. Can you talk a little bit about how people can support that effort? I'm sure a lot of listeners will be interested. Yeah.
So the website of the international group is ICFS, so International Consortium on Female Sport.
Okay.
.org, ICFsport.org. And there's a way to connect in that any group from any country you want to support.
Okay.
So in the US, the Icons Women or Champion Women, whatever, you can look at those groups and offer to donate to those individual groups. Like if you're in the UK, you should probably donate to Fair Play for Women.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And if you're in Spain, you want to do Contra Borrado or something like that.
So Icons as well seem to be great.
Well, Icons, again, the USA Icons has been super successful because that's the group of women who's one of the founders whose daughter had to compete against Leah Thomas. So, that group, and they're very well-educated women. They've got a lot of capabilities in terms of getting the message out, and they've been very good at, they've been doing a lot of work. I mean, if you look at what they've been able to achieve, like, remember, Leah Thomas was in the NCAA final only in March of 2022, which was just a little over a year ago. And Icons women have been representing, they have done some incredible work. And and of course they had the big conference now in Denver back in July where, I presented there too, some of this timeline.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support is the fuel that keeps this train running.
So please be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platforms.
And do be sure to check out the conversations that are happening on YouTube in the comments section. We think that we have some of the smartest, most engaged viewers out there, and we really appreciate all of the interactions.
Also, we produce additional bonus content every week for our listener community on Patreon. Go to widerlenspod.com and click on Join Our Listener Community. Your financial support means a lot to us.
And for those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups, so please do check those out. You can find links to both of them at widerlenspod.com or in the show notes.
And of course, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans, out now in the UK and coming out very soon in the US.
Thank you so much. Now back to the show.
But the thing that it really, really hit me when the president, when was running into this sort of progressive misogyny, like somehow the girls aren't going to do this, or, that somehow you're supposed to be nice, you're supposed to be inclusive, if it's a male person wanting to be a woman, and even at that expense to yourself. When I went through that, it put my mind back, and was a humbling experience for me personally, because back in the 90s, I was sent to Iran and Muslim countries to teach. My specialty was being sent by the international governing body, like Global World Athletics. I would be sent as an official lecturer into countries, Islamic countries, to teach Muslim women how to coach girls, because it's segregated society. And I remember when I was like the first, that was a famous course actually in 1995, because that was the first time since the revolution, since the Ayatollahs had took over, that a Western woman was even allowed to go into Iran to work with women and girls in sports. And so it was a big deal. And I just remember, like, it was a great experience for me. I mean, dealing with just having the women welcome me. And I was so excited because they had had no contact with Western women for 15 years. And it was amazing. So, and a lot of those women who I was teaching them how to coach girls, they had been like westernized in the 70s before the takeover. But anyway, so I remember thinking, well, these things happen in places like Iran and Bahrain or in whatever, but they're not going to happen in my society.
Yeah.
And when this thing started happening with self-ID in women's sports, I thought, we're not exempt. We have men who are just going to clamp down and make new rules for us, just like what I saw in Iran. And I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's the same sort of, I don't know, motivation somehow there, or that I'm thinking that somehow women just need to shut up and put up with whatever rules we make, and you don't ask questions.
Was there a moment like when you first saw self-ID impact girls' sports, or maybe not necessarily self-ID, but trans issues impact? Yeah.
No, definitely did, when it was like the Connecticut girls and the high school boys running against the girls in Connecticut, and actually Rachel McKinnon, the cyclist, winning the World Masters. So you were watching it. You were watching it. I was watching while I was reading the results, or watching on now YouTube videos and stuff. Yeah. And just thinking, this is real. I can't believe this is real. And, even when you read the policy, I read the policy before I realized it was actually happening in reality. And I had imagined, when you read a policy that says a man can come in and declare as a woman, and then we're supposed to accept him as a woman and let him compete with the women. In your brain, you imagine how that's going to work, that the guy will show up and, and he's going to look like a man and in a woman's race. You kind of imagine this, right? But then you go online and you see it's actually happening. And can I just tell for people who don't know, so Rachel McKinnon is a trans woman who competed and looked very manly all along, and all along.
Yeah,
never mitigated anything.
Never mitigated, never reduced his testosterone or whatever.
No. I can't imagine they did.
I presume identifies as she, her now, but certainly extraordinarily male looking to anybody visually. And then the Connecticut story, which I think other people won't know about, was two trans-identified teenage boys, as far as I remember, were running in track in the schools kind of level. Is that right?
At the high school level, yeah.
And had they, because I want to lead this into something I want to ask you about, had they taken any puberty blockers or anything like that? And I know they competed against girls and therefore took girls' places arguably on their run up to college. So could you just say a little bit about that? Because not everybody will know about this.
Yeah, well, Andrea Yearwood and I forget the other name, but there was two males who were self-identifying as girls and running in high school competitions in the 100-meter sprints and maybe 200. But what happened was that it was self-ID, They were not compelled to take any hormones or drugs or anything, but maybe they were. Who knows what they were doing, and like as far as part of their transition journey. But more than 15 state championships were taken from girls over like a 1 or 2 year period where they were able to do this. And those girls have been litigating. Now, there is an example of the girls did take the school board to court. It was first shot down, and then they relitigated, and then they got back. I think it's just like in the States, you go, there's like, I don't know how many cycles of suing and legal action you can do, but they're still, I think, in the middle of trying to get some accountability for that and compensation somehow. But I mean, their whole high school, you're only in high school for a blip. Like you're there for 1 or 2 years, and then you move on, and then, then your whole trajectory is different than what it probably would have been.
And the thing about being an elite sports person, you're always questioned whether you're good enough to really go for it, to really focus. So you're easily derailed.
Of course.
It takes, so it really would. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what's your position, because it's very hot really in where we've been, writing the gender framework for GenSpect, which is kind of a non-medicalized approach to gender issues. And what is your approach towards sports for children who have blocked their puberty? Yeah.
Well, my first answer is you should never block puberty. I mean, part of my PhD, my PhD project was in kinesiology, but it was in the whole idea of physical anthropology, where you're looking at size, shape, proportion, composition, and gross function of a growing, and in my case, I was looking at growing children. So children and young, whether it's for athletes or whatever, athletics or other things, but how the body changes and over time and through puberty. And so I was actually dealing with the pubertal growth spurt and looking at the different databases of African children, North American children. Like I had a lot of different databases. And I mean, that the very idea, like if you had told me in the 90s when I was doing my PhD and I was looking at the puberty and the process, and of course, James Tanner and the stages of puberty and going through, Fetus into Man, like the amazing book and all of that stuff. I mean, if you would have told me, somebody sometime in the next 20 years is going to recommend that you would actually block the pubertal process, it was so obvious. It would be so obvious that you are going to, there's critical stages. We all know this in children's development. If you block something at a critical stage, they don't get it back. It is not reversible. And you're going to have all kinds of trouble. And we also know from other sort of longitudinal studies that, the way the bones grow and the bone mineral content, bone density, bone mineral content, it's like money in the bank. You can put in the content and density until a certain age, and then everybody goes down from there. So 30% of the amount of bone mineral content is deposited during the teenage years. So if you're going to stop and block things like that, you're basically saying we're going to deplete your bank account by 30% before you become an adult in terms of bone health. So we're going to see people getting osteoporosis now by the time they're 35 or 40.
So, but your position is don't block your puberty, but when...
But if you do...
if you do...
You still should never allow a male into female competition. I don't care what age you are. Yeah. Because even before puberty, boys have 4% advantage, which is still huge. Okay, it's not the 10% advantage. It's huge. Huge.
When is that? Just... Say that again?
Right from the beginning. Like if you actually start from the very beginning of phys ed classes or measurements of the fitness tests, like when they're even 5, 6. Yeah. And it's an interesting phenomenon because at 4, 5, and 6, boys can be like better than girls in the jumping. So lower body, like jumping and running, it's in the 3 to 4% zone, pre-puberty. Yeah. But throwing, they still have a huge, 15%. Yeah. So upper body, little boys, and I know this when I coach kids, like you can ask a little boy to do a pull-up and it's no problem. You ask a little girl. Yeah. So there's something about the shoulder girdle and the way you have leverage that the male body has a different way to leverage, like if you were doing a wrestling or so basically upper body strength for little boys is way superior. And even that can be seen by 5, 6, and 7 with ball throw, for example. But let me say this. When you get to age 9, 10, 11, we all know this, that sometimes little girls, if you go to a grade 6 class, grade 5 class, you'll see little girls who suddenly mature really early. Like you'll see little girls who have breasts and that like they go through puberty earlier than the boys. And there's some of these classes where a little girl will look like a young woman and the boys still look like they're grade 1. Like it's there, you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes there's a difference. So what happens is in 9, 10, and 11, suddenly when you measure their physical performance, suddenly it looks like there's almost no difference between boys and girls in some cases and I would say that's because the girls are now have advanced in maturity by about two years. So that suddenly, like what you're going to see is boys are way better than girls at 5, 6, and 7, 8, and then it narrows because the girls have suddenly jumped ahead in maturity.
Yeah, but then it switches.
Then it goes back out and even more. And so a lot of these studies that compare pre-puberty versus post-puberty differences in performance, they only start their measurements at 9, 10, or 11, and it looks like there's no difference between boys and girls. But that's because they don't realize if they had extended the chart and measured earlier, there is an advantage. But there's just some girls that have suddenly had gone through their growth spurt early, way 2 years earlier than the boys, and suddenly they look like they can run just as fast as the boys. But that's only because of the maturity factor.
Okay, so you're basically saying that even pre-puberty, it is inappropriate for puberty-blocked boys to compete against girls. Okay.
Absolutely.
There are so many things I still want to ask you about, but one really quick question. A lot of times you hear in this debate that the number of male to female trans athletes trying to compete against women is very, very small. It's infinitesimal. It's a negligible. But do you have any numbers to ground us in what's real?
No, because in Canada, in this country, you're not even allowed to ask.
Okay.
That's the problem. It's happening a lot. I'm getting letters from parents. Like my 9-year-old daughter had to compete against a boy, and so many people write me privately, and yet you never see stats on this at all because you're not supposed to ask. You're supposed to be polite. You're supposed to be accepting. And so it's almost impossible to collect those data. Like you just can't, it's hard to even, monitor what's going on. But see, even if it was only one, I would still say, one is too many because you're disenfranchising one little girl. How many girls need to be disenfranchised before we say the rule is, and also even if there was no difference between boys and girls, which there is physically pre-puberty, why does the psychosocial preference of a little girl not matter? Yeah. Like little girls don't want to compete against little boys and they'll tell me that. Yeah. Like, why does that not matter? Yeah. Why is it just what the little boys want? Yeah. And in my particular, after the 2018 realization, I noticed that we weren't going to get protected from above. So as a provincial president, I just made sure my association had a sex-based policy at home on the ground. And it has worked really well. I mean, it's been a really, we've had about 3 or 4, I mean, I'm no longer president as of this past May, but we've had people and anecdotes like where a club in one of our cities has had 1 or 2 parents come and say, can our little boy be with the girls? And they'll just say like in our association, it's based on biological sex-based. And if you're born male, you don't compete with the girls. In training, we all train together. So it's completely inclusive. But when it comes to the competition, you have to stay in your own category, sex-based category. And so at the moment of entry, when they ask that question, if you have a strong guideline, you have a sex-based policy, eligibility, parents, I think it's really helpful because parents can either decide, okay, then we don't put our trans child into that, sport, or they just shrug their shoulders. And this has happened every single time. They said, okay. And the person just competed with the boys. Like, so truthfully, if you're direct and you set up a strong guideline and
just need a policy. Yeah.
You need the policy, and we have one. We were the only association, all of Canada, that established, overtly a sex-based, explicitly sex-based category. And it worked out well.
Could I ask you, because I know people will want to know now, you can avoid not avoid or, not choose to answer it. Have you any thoughts of how the Caster Semenya case should have evolved or could have evolved?
Yes. They should have just said right from the beginning.
At what point? You know what I mean?
At the 2006 or 7, when they were, the first time that Caster Semenya entered as a junior athlete at a national and a world competition, there has to be a screening even at that point.
So you're saying a swab test?
They did it, a swab test or something, but they didn't do the swab test. But that when it was reported, oh dear, this looks like it's a boy. People were privately, as far as I could tell from certain stories inside the sport, obviously there was a medical exam eventually done, and they knew Semenya was DSD XY.
Yeah, we better tell people who don't know. So, for people who aren't sporty.
Caster Semenya is a South African-born intersex with a difference in sexual development, male XY, but had testes internally. They had not descended, so had the ability to develop, to produce testosterone, but did have, obviously ambiguous genitalia. So it wasn't the people in the village thought Caster Semenya was a girl, female. But through, was always presenting somewhat male. And then during puberty got a very strong male type body that was succeeding in female sport. Now, here's the interesting thing. And I've spent time working on the African continent. When I was collecting data for my PhD thesis and measuring children in schools in Nigeria, it was very clear, and people had told, all the experts in on the ground, the Nigerian principals, would tell me that especially in the villages, because part of my data collection sheet had the birth date, you get your birth date, and 60% of children in rural Africa don't have a birth certificate and don't have a birth date. You have to so they're not tested. So what I'm saying is, in North America and Europe, we would be able to flag a DSD immediately and deal with it. The problem with the developing countries, whether it's India, Africa, whatever, is most of them never get a medical screening of any type. And a lot of times, even their date of birth is not really recorded. It's they were born in the year when there was that rain and that fall, that season. So then you have to kind of figure out sort of within 3 months, 2 or 3 months, that was their date of birth. Some of them have, a lot of them have now, because we have phones. This has changed Africa. Now they have phones, they know the date, they know the time, they can put it, they'll know because of photos and whatever. But in those days, in the 90s, they didn't. And so 90s and 2000s, if you were born in Africa and you had a DSD, there's no way that would ever be known, because you probably haven't seen a doctor to do that.
And with Caster, they figured it out in the teenage years. They kind of...
Yeah, so so Caster just went into the women's competition, looked like a phenomenal athlete for a female in South Africa, was on immediately within almost less than a year of starting track, was already a world, best in the junior level. And I mean, just based on appearance too, you could pretty well surmise that there was something going on. There was a extraordinary advantage. And they did do some testing, and they did know that Caster was XYDSD right from the beginning.
Wow. If
they would have had a strong policy from the beginning, all of that stuff wouldn't have happened. But the problem is they didn't want to appear to be racist, which is the problem with, it's inherent in how this happens, because they will be from another country, from a developing country, because they didn't get screened. And so then it's up to the sport to screen them.
Not only that, in Helen Joyce's book as well, she's brilliant. Some of the data in that book is so phenomenal. Yeah. She did say that in certain pockets, in certain areas around the world, intersex, DSDs, is much higher than others.
Oh, yeah. It can be there too,
Yeah, and that's also an issue that needs to be kind of highlighted.
Yeah, well, but that plays out on the global stage in that the people who should be putting in the guidelines and the gatekeeping, now they don't want to be appearing to be racist or culturally insensitive. And so that's, again, but what they don't understand is that having somebody like Caster Semenya in with the women, XY DSD male in with the women, it's not like you were only protecting white people or white women. I mean, it was women of all different racial groups who were being basically discriminated against. And the truth is, this also happens. Now I went to the Icons, the NC2A convention with Icons in January of this year. And one of the high school, this turns my attention to what you say, you were going to ask me what I say to you, but there was a young woman of university age who instantly, she flipped in front of me. It was an interesting experience because we had a booth at the convention and we were talking, she and our sister were there, and they were clearly, obviously sensitive about the trans issue and also we're really keen on inclusivity and fairness. And I said, well, okay, do you agree that there's two sexes? And we all start with two sexes. You can't be trans unless you're born one sex and you want to see, so we all start in a sort of a binary situation, and then people have different expressions and maybe lots of different, ways to have a gender expression, whatever. And I said, but then let's go through this experiment. So we know that there are females who want to identify as men or not non-binary, and there are males who want to identify as women. And basically, so we have two types of trans. We have the males who identify as women and females who identify as men. These ones stay in women's sports. So we're already inclusive. The ones who are female, but they identify as men, they just compete as female and they know that they shouldn't be taking drugs. Otherwise, they're going to be doping. There's going to be doping control. So if you have these ones who are male and now identify as women, they come over. They're actually discriminating even against the females who are trans.
Yeah.
So I said, it's not about trans or not trans. It's are we going to discriminate against all types of female people?
It's about fairness.
And so she says, she stopped for a minute. She turned her back to me, she just turns around and she goes, wait. And she looked at me, she goes, so this is just the same old men making women do what they want? And I'm like, well, males who want to have an advantage. Type
of guy.
The females aren't looking for, can't get advantage going the other way. So we're already accepting trans who are female born. And that's the thing. It's not discriminating at all as if we keep them separate.
Well, Linda, this brings up something that I'd like to touch on with you in our dinner party conversations, because there was an interesting post in the Washington Post about non-binary athletes and using testosterone. So I'd love to take it over there. Before we say goodbye to our general audience, of course, we want to link your book. We want to link all of the organizations that you mentioned. Is there anywhere else listeners should go to find more information about you and your work?
Well, I am Coach Blade on Twitter, and I put a lot of material there.
Okay,
knocking it out of the park.
And if you're
pun intended,
exactly. And if you're looking for, there's a lot of podcasts and articles I've written, and actually, there's also this latest one. I have a chapter, and this is a new book coming out.
Wow.
It's by the WDI, Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs.
Great.
I have a chapter in there. There's a new book that's come out.
Oh, that's great.
And so I've just written chapters, articles in different places. I will say that in terms of the conference coming up next week, I didn't want to go through the same kind of I did want to cover the history, the historical record and journey briefly, but it occurred to me, I was looking at just the other day, thing about the 7 stages of grief.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And and everything I've gone through in this journey is one of those 7 stages. So basically the 7 stages of reclamation of women's sports, literally, it's just two, it's the one stage, this is how I felt, and that's how it works in sports. And feeling shock, it's a shock. And then all through, and I just kind of think about, I think it might be worth going through, just how a person in my position, of authority and as a woman in sport, how you feel like grief that this has happened. It's like changes your whole worldview of how you thought of women in sport and the perception of the status of women in sport.
Gosh. Yeah.
And then just how it goes through like the stages of grief and how to rebuild. Because the last few stages of grief are basically just how do you reconstruct and work through it, and then how do you work towards acceptance in the future. And then in my case, how are we going to change everything? How are we going to be effective going forward and change things back so we can sort of turn this around. And so that's pretty much what I'm going to be covering, I think, next week.
Amazing.
And
this episode is going to be coming out on the 3rd, which is right before the conference.
Right before.
I really hope that anyone listening who's interested in what Coach Blade has to say will tune into the conference, whether you're there in person
you
or
can get
online.
You can get live streaming, and
is it live streamed?
Yeah, it's going to be live streamed, and
promote that.
Yeah, and afterwards as well, it will be available on YouTube.
Yeah,
I think you're going to be such an addition. You're such a really brilliant representative of why sports. People who are sports people, they're fair. That's the big thing. They're into fairness usually.
Yeah, we want to be.
Yeah, that's the thing.
That's the whole purpose. I mean, it isn't sport if it isn't fair. That's why my book was called Unsporting. Because if it's not fair, it's not even sport anymore. It's just like maybe social affirmation or something. But, it has to be fair if it's going to be sports. That's the point.
You're right.
That's amazing, Linda. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. Listener support means a lot to us. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave a review.
For more information, visit widerlenspod.com. There you'll learn about joining our listener community, how to contribute to our show, and where to find us on social media.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.